If you frequent the internet, you'll likely have seen that recently Jesse Ridgeway, known on social media as McJuggerNuggets, and his wife Ashley have made headlines after announcing their decision to terminate their pregnancy after prenatal testing showed a 95% chance that their baby boy would be born with Down syndrome. Unsurprisingly to most, the internet had a lot of opinions on this, from her body, her choice, to calling them ableist monsters for making this decision. And this controversy has opened the door to some really important discussions that I think we need to be having. So we're going to talk about it. Let's go. In April of this year, Jesse and Ashley announced that they were expecting their first child.
Hey there, Joey, it's your old pal McJuggerNuggets here, and we're having a baby! Yay!
At first, they were excited, their audience was excited, and their pregnancy became a part of their content. Then, shortly into the pregnancy, they received prenatal testing results that showed a 95% chance that the baby would be born with Down syndrome. Shortly after that, they made the decision to terminate the pregnancy, and suffice it to say, the internet exploded. Some defend their right to choose, while others saw a much darker side, a wanted child becoming unwanted after a disability diagnosis. And that's where this conversation really begins, because this isn't really a debate about abortion. It's a conversation about human value. And it opens the door to the question, what does society say when a wanted child becomes unwanted after receiving a disability diagnosis? One huge mistake that I've noticed as all this controversy unfolded is that people are trying to shove this situation into pre-existing political boxes. If you're pro-choice, you're expected to support this. And if you're pro-life, you're expected to condemn it. But the problem is many people aren't fitting neatly into either one of those camps. You can support a woman's right to choose abortion while also feeling deeply uncomfortable with the reason behind that particular abortion. They aren't mutually exclusive positions, and there's a level of nuance to everything in life. A lot of critics aren't arguing against abortion or whether or not it should be illegal. Like myself, for example, I think that it's really messed up that a bunch of middle-aged white men think that they can decide to ban abortion. I think that criminalizing abortion and even miscarriages is dangerous, stupid, and immoral. Especially given that the United States doesn't care about children after they're born. They care more about children in the womb. These political lawmakers, that is. But that's not where a lot of this current discourse lies. People are asking a very different question. If a wanted child becomes unwanted after a disability diagnosis, what message does that send to people currently living with a disability? And a huge reason why people are struggling to accept this kind of decision goes way deeper than simply being pro-life, because this wasn't an unwanted pregnancy, or a teenager in crisis, or someone facing financial hardship if they were to bring this baby into the world. And this wasn't even a case of a baby being incompatible with life. They wanted this pregnancy. They planned for it. They anticipated it. They got excited and announced it. They made content out of it and monetized it. And then everything changed after the possibility of a Down syndrome diagnosis entered the conversation. And for a lot of critics, that's a distinction that they can't get past. Not because the pregnancy ended, but because the reason was seemingly tied to a disability. And another reason that this story gained a lot of traction is because prenatal testing isn't a diagnosis. 95% is a very high chance. That's what their test results came back as, which is very significant information. But probability is still probability. It's not certainty. It's not a diagnosis. And adding fuel to this fire, the prenatal test that they used, the company that runs it has recently been sued and gone through a ton of litigation for false positives and also for the way that they communicate those results to the parents. which doesn't mean that the results were wrong. I'm pretty confident that they got an amnio and they had further testing done. But it does raise a really uncomfortable question, and that is, how much certainty should a parent have, or does a parent need, before making an irreversible decision? This isn't just about this one case. It's a wider conversation about the validity of prenatal testing and how those results are communicated to parents. And something I found interesting was in their video where they're doing the gender reveal and they find out the news that the baby had that high chance of being born with Downs. Jesse turns to his parents and asks them about him potentially having a Down syndrome diagnosis.
Because weren't you saying I was supposed to have Down syndrome?
Well, they were just, that wasn't because of any marker. That was only because of your femur and relationship to the size of your head. And they said that sometimes, I guess, back then was a sign, but it wasn't a blood test.
And even though it might not be the exact same thing, that was based off of measurements, and genetic testing has come a long way since then, it's really interesting or ironic that his parents faced the same moral dilemma and still went through with their pregnancy. And had they not, Jesse would not be here today. And in his most recent live stream, he even makes a comment, something along the lines of, yeah, of course I'm glad my dad didn't abort me, but I'm normal. And he's used the word normal to describe himself versus a child or person with disability. And although I understand what he's trying to get across, that type of language is inherently harmful to people of the disabled community. When that kind of language is used to describe a typically developed human being, it sends an extremely hurtful message to those who are currently in the disabled community, which is a community that anyone can join at any point in time in their life. And critics also point out the fact that they seem to have gone to really extraordinary measures to save their dogs. In an Instagram post here, Jesse says, "Sweet super 6th birthday. After she was diagnosed with stage 4 kidney disease last year around her 5th birthday, the vet said she had weeks to live. If we were lucky, maybe a few months. Here we are a whole year later. She is still fighting. She is in the 0.0001% of superhero dogs that can continue living with no kidneys. It has been an emotional celebration. We all need a hero in this life. Jenny has been one of mine. Keep fighting, Miss Poppy. We love you lots." Yet when they were faced with a potentially difficult diagnosis in pregnancy, they chose a different path. And for some viewers, that contrast was pretty hard to ignore. Now, this is where things get really uncomfortable, but oftentimes those uncomfortable conversations are the most important ones worth having. I want to take a moment now to talk about eugenics, because that's a word that's being thrown around a lot in this case. Historically, eugenics was the belief that society could be improved by encouraging certain people to reproduce and discouraging others from it. And when people hear the word eugenics, they often think government tactics like forced sterilization and state control and the big scary stuff. But critics argue that modern eugenics can look a little bit like what happened here. Because now, rather than the government making those decisions for society, the individual has the opportunity to make them for themselves. Instead of laws eliminating disabilities, modern-day prenatal testing has dramatically decreased the number of children born with certain genetic conditions. And Jesse wasn't lying when he said this is incredibly common, and people just don't talk about it. It is estimated that upwards of 60 to 90% of babies who are prenatally diagnosed with Down syndrome are aborted. I saw an article from one mom who said she was offered termination 15 times after her son received a Down syndrome diagnosis. Those are statistics that are hard to ignore, especially when we're talking about prenatal testing and eugenics. And now the question becomes, if society overwhelmingly chooses to abort babies with Down syndrome when given the option, what does that say about the value placed on people currently living with Down syndrome? That's not an easy question, but it is one worth discussing and a big reason why I wanted to continue to have this discussion. Because this isn't just about a fetus. It's also about living people too. Imagine being someone currently living with Down syndrome, or translate it to any other disability or ailment, CP, ADHD, and autism. Now imagine seeing millions of people debate whether or not someone like you should even exist, or describing your life as tragic, or parents saying, I could never parent a child like you. Whether or not intended, that's where that message lands. And many disability advocates over the years have argued that prenatal screening and testing only focuses on the negative outcomes, not on the joy or accomplishments or quality of life that these people can end up living. And that doesn't mean that raising a child with a disability is easy. Many families face enormous challenges, but difficulty and worth are not the same thing, and that is a distinction that society often struggles with. We have parents here who saw that their life might not look the way they expected, that there might be added challenges or it might be a little harder than they anticipated, and decided not to follow through with the pregnancy, which is a decision that is completely theirs to make. I personally wouldn't want this child to be born and end up neglected or resented because he wasn't perfect in his parents' eyes, or end up worse off in foster care. But a decision like this, especially when done so publicly, won't come without scrutiny and discussion. Now, shortly after news of this broke and went viral, Jesse and Ashley decided to speak out on TMZ, and they kind of skirt around everything. They don't really say much, but one thing that stood out to me was his use of the word normal again.
You know, we're two perfectly normal people. We'd never imagine confronting having a child with Down syndrome. And you don't think it'll happen to you, and then it does, and you like to think you know what you do in that situation.
And to me, that just feels so incredibly disrespectful and dehumanizing to people currently living with disabilities, essentially calling them abnormal. And it just comes across as so incredibly ableist, especially with his comment about being grateful that his parents didn't abort him because he turned out normal. But throughout this discussion and them speaking out against the backlash that they received, there was no discussion about quality of life or the risks to mom that allegedly were increased, or their ability to care for the child. All there was a simple, there was a bunch of stuff we didn't know.
Just given the information that you know, but there was so much that we were unaware of and how hard it was.
And even though they were fully legally within their right to make this decision, the question still stands. Is it morally justified? And that's where people sit, still struggling to fully understand this decision. And this could also serve as a cautionary tale that not everything needs to be content and that some things should stay private. Even the TMZ interviewer said that he felt almost uncomfortable, like this is something that he shouldn't be watching.
I will say it was really difficult to watch both of you just break down for several minutes as you read the test results. Did you ever think about, you could be transparent in telling your audience, your followers, what the test results were without showing them you actually opening the test results? That was the part that just felt, I felt like it was invasive, like I shouldn't be watching this pain that this couple is going through like this.
Yeah. And while I agree with Jesse in the fact that this is a conversation that maybe we should be having, this is a conversation that we haven't had to have on such a public scale, and it raises some big questions about value we place on people. And even in the push for transparency and influencers being more transparent and vulnerable, we have to question, where do we draw the line? How far is too far? Especially when you're going to eternalize something on the internet, something as polarizing as this. And Jesse is right that this has kickstarted some really important conversations that people just aren't having.
For better or worse, the conversation that's being had online is one of the most important topics. You know, everyone wants, is part of a family, potentially wants to start one.
And people have the right to feel however they want to feel. And you also have the right to choose differently for yourself if you're faced with this similar situation. And a lot of people have some really good points for and some really good points against the decision that was made. But we also have the darker side of the internet who are sending them death threats. And I personally could not imagine going through this level of emotional turmoil after making an impossible decision and also having the entire internet come at me and all my pain being so public and on display for everyone. Death threats are never okay. You are allowed to feel passionate about something and share your opinion without threatening someone. That crosses a line. So now I want to focus on the fact that, as I've said a couple times now, Jesse has used the word normal to describe himself and Ashley, to describe how he turned out as a human, and glad he wasn't aborted. Anyway. So in the clip I showed earlier, as I said, it describes him and Ashley. But in his recent live stream, he says something along the lines of course I'm glad my dad didn't abort me, but I'm normal.
Yeah, of course I'm glad my dad didn't fucking terminate me. But I'm normal.
So the obvious follow-up question becomes, well, what does that say about people who aren't normal or typical? That's why those kinds of statements generate such a strong reaction and response from people, regardless of his intention using that kind of language. Words matter, especially in the disability community. We've talked about it before on my channel, how over time we adjust the language we use so that it's not hurtful or harmful for people of a specific community. And not only his repeated use of the word normal, but in some of the clips that I watched, I noticed some other red flags. First, right after they found out they were pregnant, he's sitting there and he's chatting with AI. So first off, like, yikes. But listen to his response.
Ashley's pregnant.
That's a huge milestone. How are you feeling about it? Anything on your mind as you start planning for this next chapter?
Regret.
Instant regret. Now, I can be empathetic to that overwhelming feeling, to that fear when the stick turns pink. But for someone who was actively trying for a baby, for that to be your first response, and then at the first sign of difficulty deciding to terminate, that's something that I personally just can't look past. It leaves a poor taste in my mouth. And another thing, which this is really cringy, but he also decided that the most important person to tell first was Mr. Beast. And talk about an awkward interaction.
As soon as I found out, I had to tell the most important person in the world. I gotta share some news with you, dude.
What?
I'm gonna be a dad.
Oh. Damn.
You're like the first person I'm telling.
Even though this is our first time meeting? Damn. I'm honored to know. You just found out she's pregnant?
A little bit ago, but we keeping it secret. I couldn't think of anyone better to share the news with than Mr. Beast, baby. I had to get Jimmy on the phone and let him know the big news because I want him to be the godfather to the child. I mean, if you're gonna pick somebody, you want it to be somebody who has a lot of money.
Oh my God.
And to me, it goes to show where this man's priorities lie in his content. Content that has been heavily scripted and staged and faked over his social media career. which has led to some people questioning whether or not they faked this entire thing. And to be clear, I don't think that they faked it. I don't think that they faked it just based off of how broken poor Ashley looked during that TMZ interview. But as I saw someone else say, there's a corner of Twitter where everything is a conspiracy theory, and just how exhausting that must be. This story and discussion ultimately isn't about a woman's right to choose or whether or not abortion should be outlawed. It's about how we as a society define human value. If a child is loved and wanted up until a diagnosis and unwanted after, it starts to raise some really serious questions. Questions about disability, questions about parental responsibility or quality of life, and most importantly, questions about modern day eugenics and the ethics behind it. It's a slippery slope into full-blown segregation and government eugenics, and it's worth questioning whether or not society has started to silently sort humans into acceptable and unacceptable categories. You don't have to agree with Jesse and Ashley's decision, and you also don't have to condemn it either. But I think we all need to be willing to have an honest conversation about what these kinds of decisions make, not just in regards to this couple, but about the current culture we live in. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I will talk to you guys in the next one. Bye, guys.